Humanity is subject to two kinds of law, logic and natural. These are not the same thing. Indeed, logic and natural law both dictate that these two realms are disconnected and logically incompatible. The distinction often comes down to what mankind thinks of as freedom versus servitude. The law necessarily enslaves. Often this slavery goes deeper than most understand. But freedom is not entirely what people think it is. We are not free under the law, but freedom from the law is only possible if we do not dispense with logic. As we see, these arguments are logical. Here are 3 logical statements. This essay discusses these 3 points. 1. The law cannot substitute for intelligence. 2. The majority are not the most intelligent or moral. 3. Short-term gain is often considered safer than accepting the higher risks that come from delayed gratification and investing. Some lotteries offer a cash payout to a long-term, but higher, periodic payment schedule. Perhaps the sense is that one might not live long enough to claim the entire prize, so take a much smaller payout up front. Time represents risk. The longer we wait, the less likely something becomes. An infinity of time allows anything to happen, but that also means nothing happens, because everything that can happen will also not happen. If everything is possible, nothing is possible, so we need a way to select out priorities. We need to make some events more possible than others. However, this means we have to be clear on the outcomes we want. Why give criminals light sentences, if the desired outcome is the elimination of crime? Indeed, why incarcerate criminals with their own kind, if we are going to release them? We often seem to be doing everything we can to defeat our stated goal. This we assume is to eliminate crime. But the way the process is undergone, one might assume what we were trying to do is protect our interests, whether as law enforcement, lawmaker, or even criminal. The justice system is like a conspiracy to maintain and even increase funding for law enforcement. There is no benefit to an agency to fulfill its mandate, because if it did, it would lose its funding. If the number one rule of the king is that everyone must obey him, then it is reasonable that all those who are under him and obeying him, would find it reasonable if everyone under them were required to obey them. This, however, suggests that no reasonable person will find it reasonable to obey the king, let alone those under him. The only way around this dilemma is to assume the majority are not intelligent or moral, or they would desire to obey the king and his lieutenants. This degradation of the subjects makes it reasonable to oppress the people and force them to obey the law, and by extension, the lawmakers. For the subject, obedience seems to make more sense. The costs appear lower than those that come with rebellion. Yet, there are always lawbreakers, and in time, there may well be protests and a revolution, depending on how costly it becomes to obey the law. When the subject believes the short-term gain of obeying the law is less than the costs of revolution, revolution is likely to occur. The majority may not be the most intelligent group in the nation, but they are able to ascertain their best interest. This is a problem for governments because those who find it in their best interest to support their government are not likely to be the most intelligent or moral group within the nation. They are likely to decide the short-term gain of obedience is better than the long-term costs of disobedience, only because the cost of obedience is so low for them. It is true, the law is no substitute for intelligence. An intelligent person will understand two things. He will know he must pay for what he gets and that he has no right to anything anyone else creates. But that means, no one has a right to what he created, and everyone ought to pay for what they get. It is then obvious if this simple rule was followed, governments would become redundant. There is a calculation we all make. We value time. Every second of our life has a value. This is what we call virtue. If we are making good use of people's time, we are virtuous. Virtue, often seen as an intrinsic quality of moral excellence, is not merely a static characteristic but a dynamic process of aligning one's actions with the highest standards of goodness and integrity. It demands a cultivated awareness of the impact of one's deeds, extending beyond personal gain to encompass the welfare of others and the community at large. Virtue is the pursuit of moral good, a commitment to act justly, and an unwavering fidelity to one's ethical principles. The essence of virtue lies in the appreciation and wise management of time, our most precious resource. Every moment holds potential for virtuous action, where each second is a chance to contribute positively to society. This recognition of the temporal value is what propels individuals to strive towards virtue, making the best use of their own time and that of others. In a virtuous life, time is not squandered on fruitless endeavors but invested in meaningful pursuits that enhance collective well-being. Furthermore, true virtue encompasses the understanding that we are all stewards of our creations and those of others. It embodies the principle that each person ought to receive just recompense for their contributions while respecting the rights and efforts of others. This mutual respect fosters a society where virtue flourishes, as individuals recognize the intrinsic value in fairness, accountability, and the just distribution of rewards. In such a society, governments would find their roles minimized, as the citizens' virtuous conduct would naturally uphold justice and equity. Virtue requires an understanding of the objective or purpose of man. It is not enough to simply strive for an ambiguous excellence, we need a clear understanding of what it requires to be perfect. To be virtuous means that we not only strive towards perfection, but our goal is also the perfection of others, and ultimately, the perfection of the state and the world. Therein lays the problem, for perfection is not found in the average opinion of all persons. Virtue, and therefore merit, is found in the excellent few, what Plato called the philosopher kings. The average man cannot vote in who the philosopher king is, and in fact, even were he able to identify the most virtuous of men, the average man is unlikely to vote for him. The concept of democracy is, therefore, absurd, prima facie. It is a sleight of hand, a tactic for enslaving others without, hopefully, being constrained ourselves. We vote in a government to control and oppress others. We do not think we need the state's oversight, ourselves. There are three kinds of government. There is tyranny which oppresses the people for the benefit of the political elite. But these have no power but that of the sword. When the power of the sword was direct and low technology, the state could act like a criminal gang. So long as the elite could overcome the populace by sheer military might, there was no need to make concessions to the subject population. But as technology developed, particularly the invention of guns, it became harder to oppress the domestic population. They were needed, not just for the armies, which had grown in size, but also for the manufacture of modern weapons and products for export to gain more wealth. There was a need to incorporate more persons into the government. And so, democracy was developed. This was not the democracy of Athens where only the rich and indolent had a voice and vote, yeoman farmers and other property owners were also given the vote. This gave rise to two new forms of government. One is socialist and the other is capitalist. Both are democracies. But the confusing thing is, there are two kinds of socialism. The common form is the socialism of the poor. But there is also a socialism of the wealthy. Socialism proper is the socialism we are familiar with. The state attempts to curry favor with the poor as these are numerous and in need of the government. The government, of course, has a problem. It cannot do anything for anyone based on its own merits. Anything the government does is done by proxy, that is, it must only serve as a broker, taking from Peter to give to Paul. But in this case, Paul is broke and can give little or nothing in return. So, Peter often becomes annoyed at this imbalance and works to undermine the socialist state to bring in one favorable to capitalism. But capitalists have their own secret. They have their own skeleton in the closet. The devil is clever, he cannot prove the poor have a right to what others possess, but on the other hand, he cannot prove the rich have a right to the assets of the natural world. And so, he has them each fight the other regarding the other's fictitious claim. But neither can admit no one has any right to possess what they did not create. If the poor seek to live off the rich seek to live off of God. That is civilization's dirty little secret. Civilization is a parasite. All democracy does is decide which parasite to unleash and which to hold in check. For years the socialists had the reins of power. Under Trump and other far-right groups, the rich are staging a comeback, even a coup. This will make things marginally better, even as it weakens government. The rich have a problem. They do not want the state to do anything for them, other than cover their backs. This does not require a large government. The problem for the wealthy is that they will vote for a government, but it is a very truncated state. There is little reason for a politician to seek the vote of the wealth, at the total expense of the poor. So even so-called conservative parties always hedge their bets. They talk about supporting private enterprise, but they never dare throw the poor under the bus. Support for capitalism is always conditional. Canadian conservatives are always tepid in their support for capitalism because the country is too socialist to go far right. Yet it is the wealthy who make the money, including jobs. And so, no government can totally invalidate the upper and middle classes. Conservative pledge to marginally help the rich and the liberals and socialists will claim to marginally disfavor them. But neither side can reject socialism or capitalism. The poor are too numerous and the rich too powerful. The real problem is that the arguments of both the left and right are too weak to be compelling. That is, neither the right or the left can convince enough persons on the other side to matter. So their arguments are weak, it is inarguable. Democracy is irrational. It cannot work. It is in fact satanic. One does not vote to keep the status quo. That does not make sense either. Governments always change things, they must. The very fact that one engages in an election means one is voting for change. This change is wrought by a state that has no means to do anything without acquiring resources from the body politic. Therefore, right at the start, the voter has rejected God in order to put their faith in the political process. Democracy fails because it removes us from God, it rewards us for failing to trust God. Democracy fails because it requires us to put our faith in man. Democracy tacitly assumes we will be better off if we learn to trust man for more and more of our wants and needs. We vote for the politician that makes us the most believable promises. If we rely on this politician to provide for us, then we lack faith in God. The more we rely on democracy, the more we rely on other men for our needs. This is why democracy fails. The 3 points are grounded in men putting their faith in other men via the democratic process and why this is a bad idea. 1. The law cannot substitute for intelligence. 2. The majority are not the most intelligent or moral. 3. Short-term gain is often considered safer than accepting the higher risks that come from delayed gratification and investing.